The wind in the borderlands was a thief. It stole the warmth from your skin, the moisture from your lips, and the hope from your soul. For Ilara, it had stolen everything else. At 24, she was already a ghost, a hollowed-out memory of the woman she'd once been, forever tethered to a life that had ended with her husband's last breath. The villagers saw his death in the lines of her face and the famine in the shadow she cast. Their whispers are constant, corrosive acid eating away at her spirit. She moved through her days like a phantom, the ache of grief a dull, familiar companion, but a sharper, more primal fear now eclipsed it, the gnawing terror of failing the small, trusting hand that held hers. It felt as if her silent scream was carried on that very wind, a plea to anyone, anywhere. I wonder who is hearing this story now. Let me know in the comments your name, where you're watching from, and what time it is for you. And if this story resonates, please subscribe to the channel. Her world had shrunk to the size of a single, relentless task: survival. Each sunrise was a renewed declaration of war against the gnawing hunger that plagued both her and the orphaned boy, Leo. Their home was a crumbling hovel at the edge of the village, a place where the wind howled through the cracks with a mournful voice. Days were spent foraging for withered roots, begging for scraps at the market where doors were slammed in her face, and mending clothes that were more patch than fabric. The villagers' scorn was a physical barrier, their eyes cold and accusing. They saw her as a curse, a blight upon their already struggling community. Ilara endured it all, her hands calloused and raw, her body aching with a fatigue that went bone deep. She wasn't fighting for a grand destiny or a lost love. She was fighting for the simple, sacred right for a child to eat, to be safe from the grim prospect of servitude that loomed like a vulture over the destitute. Beneath the stoic mask she wore for Leo's sake, Ilara was fraying at the seams. The weight of her assumed guilt was a crushing burden, a cloak woven from the village's superstition and her own private sorrow. They blamed her for the drought, for the sickness, for the bad luck that clung to their homes like soot. She had stopped trying to defend herself, for their judgment had seeped into her own heart, poisoning her memories. Was she truly a harbinger of misfortune? This quiet, insidious doubt was her greatest tormentor. Her fierce, protective love for Leo was the only anchor in the storm of her despair, but it was also her deepest vulnerability. In the dead of night, when the boy slept soundly, she would allow herself to dream not of wealth or a new beginning, but of a single, impossible moment of quiet, a day where the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs was finally, blessedly, filled. The change began not with a sound, but with a sudden, unnerving stillness. The ever-present wind, which had been her constant companion in misery, died completely. A hush fell over the desolate landscape, so profound that Ilara could hear the frantic beat of her own heart. The grey, overcast sky began to shimmer with an ethereal, silvery light that did not belong to this world of dust and decay. She pulled Leo closer, her hand instinctively going to the small, worn wooden bird her husband had carved for her years ago. A strange scent filled the air, not of dust or rain, but of damp earth, ancient forests, and a faint electric tang of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. It was a scent of impossible things, of magic and power, and it made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. She was being watched. The feeling was as certain and as terrifying as a blade pressed against her throat. Her eyes scanned the barren horizon, searching for the source of the disturbance. There, cresting the low, dusty hill, was a figure. It was not a villager, nor a trader, nor any kind of man she had ever seen. He was tall and impossibly regal, his silhouette sharp and defined against the strange, shimmering sky. He moved with a liquid grace that was utterly alien to the harsh, unforgiving land. As he drew nearer, she saw he was not alone. He was flanked by two guards in gleaming, leaf-shaped armor, their faces severe and otherworldly. Panic seized her, cold and sharp. These were not men from the borderlands. They were something else entirely, something from the old tales whispered by firesides, tales of immortal beings and dying magic. The lead figure stopped a dozen paces from her crumbling doorway, his gaze piercing and intense, and she knew, with a certainty that froze the very blood in her veins, that her life and its relentless, miserable pattern was about to be shattered forever. Before the wind became a thief, it had been a singer. It had sung through the eaves of a sturdier home, a place filled with the scent of freshly cut pine and the low, steady sound of her husband, Kyle, carving wood by the fire. Their life together had not been one of grand passion or poetic declarations, but of a quiet, profound companionship built on shared burdens and small, earned comforts. She remembered the solid warmth of his hand in hers, the calluses a familiar map of his labor. He had been a man of the earth, steady and dependable, his presence a shield against the harshness of the borderlands. His death was not a dramatic battle or a noble sacrifice. It was a simple, brutal fever that stole his breath in the night, leaving a silence in their home so vast and absolute that it felt like the world itself had stopped breathing. That silence had been the first thing the wind stole, replacing it with its own mournful howl. The village's cruelty began as a slow poison, seeping into the cracks of her grief. In the weeks after Kyle's death, the drought worsened, the soil cracking like sun-baked pottery. The well ran low, and a sickness took two of the elders. Pity for the young widow curdled into suspicion, then into open accusation. They saw her not as a woman mourning, but as an omen, a vessel of misfortune Kale's presence had somehow kept contained. Whispers followed her like shadows, sharp and pointed, blaming her for every misfortune, from a stillborn calf to a blighted crop. She became a pariah, the focus of their collective fear and frustration. Her pain was an inconvenience they no longer wished to witness, and her presence a curse they desperately wanted to excise. The rejection was a physical wound, a constant ache in her chest that was sharper and more persistent than even her hunger, for it fed on her very spirit. Her bond with Leo was forged in the crucible of that shared desolation. He was not her son by blood, but the child of their neighbors, a young couple who had succumbed to the same fever that had claimed Kale. When they died, the village turned a blind eye to the small, silent boy left behind. They saw another mouth to feed, another burden in a land of scarcity. But Ilara saw the same bewildered terror in his eyes that she felt in her own heart. Taking him in was not a calculated decision, but an instinct, a desperate act of defiance against the crushing apathy of her world. She would not let another soul be consumed by the emptiness that had taken her husband. This fierce, protective love became her sole reason for being, a singular purpose that gave her the strength to face each dawn. Leo was her anchor, but also her heaviest chain, binding her to this life of endless struggle. The village's condemnation eventually became her own internal verdict. In the suffocating quiet of the nights, with Leo sleeping beside her, the doubts would creep in. What if they were right? What if she was a blight, a magnet for sorrow? The evidence felt irrefutable. Her husband was dead, the land was dying, and every hand she reached for was pulled away in revulsion. This creeping belief that she was fundamentally tainted, a source of ruin, was the deepest and most painful of her wounds. It was why the thought of romance, of another's touch or a shared future, was an impossible, terrifying fantasy. Love was not a salvation, it was a risk she could never take. To let someone close would be to invite their destruction, to mark them with the same curse that she believed she carried. She was a ghost, and ghosts could not afford the warmth of the living. And then they came. The Elf King and his guards were an apparition of impossible beauty and power set against the backdrop of her squalor. The leader, Theron, did not look at her hovel or the barren land. He looked directly at her, his gaze an unnerving weight that seemed to see past her tattered clothes and gaunt features, peering into the frayed edges of her soul. His stillness was more intimidating than any overt threat. It was the absolute calm of a predator, of a being so certain of his own power that he had no need for aggression. She saw the subtle, almost invisible curl of distaste on his lips as his eyes took in the grime of her world, a world so far removed from the gleaming perfection of his own being. In that moment, she was not a person to him. She was a strange, pitiful creature he had found crawling in the dust. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not what she expected. It held no warmth, no pity, but it was not cruel either. It was like polished stone, ancient and resonant, carrying an authority that was absolute and unquestionable. "You will come with me," he said, the words not a request, but a statement of fact. His silver eyes flickered to Leo, who was hiding behind her, and for a fleeting instant, a strange, unreadable emotion crossed his face. It wasn't compassion. It was something more akin to a prospector finding a rare gem in a river of mud. He was not rescuing them. He was claiming them. The two guards moved forward, their movements silent and fluid, their intent clear. There was no room for argument, no possibility of refusal. Her world, which had been a slow, grinding descent into nothingness, was about to be violently and irrevocably upended. A strange, tingling energy filled the air, emanating from the king. It was not a physical touch, but it felt like one. A force that lifted the crushing weight of exhaustion from her limbs and replaced it with a terrifying, weightless sensation. The crumbling walls of her hovel seemed to dissolve, the grey, dusty sky blurring into a cascade of shimmering, silvery light. She clutched Leo tightly, her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, overwhelming silence. The familiar scent of dust and despair was replaced by the clean, sharp smell of ozone and damp, ancient earth. She was being moved, transported through means she could not comprehend, away from the only life she had ever known. She had no idea where she was going, or why this impossible, godlike being had sought her out, but as the last vestiges of her world faded, one terrifying certainty remained. She had just traded a slow death for a fate she couldn't even begin to imagine. The transition was not a journey, but a severance. One moment, she stood in the familiar dust and decay of the borderlands. The next, she was somewhere else entirely. The air itself a different substance. It was cold, clean, and carried the scent of night-blooming flowers and damp, ancient stone. They stood in a vast hall of polished white marble that seemed to glow with its own internal light. Silver-barked trees grew impossibly tall, their leaves of hammered gold and emerald, yet their branches were tinged with a faint, sickly grey pallor at the very tips. The silence here was not empty, but full, a resonant quiet that hummed with a power she could feel on her skin. It was a place of breathtaking, sterile beauty, so perfect and so alien that it made her own ragged existence feel like a profanity. She pulled Leo closer, his small body trembling, as she felt the crushing weight of her own insignificance in this gilded, dying world. At the far end of the hall, upon a throne carved from a single piece of what looked like solidified moonlight, sat Theron. He was no longer a harsh silhouette against a dusty sky, but a figure of terrible and overwhelming clarity. His silver hair was so fine it seemed to float like spun mist around a face of sharp, aristocratic planes and a mouth that held no hint of softness. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were ancient and held a weariness that contradicted the ageless perfection of his features. He wore robes of deep midnight blue, embroidered with silver thread that mapped constellations she had never seen. His power was not a proclamation, but an atmosphere, a palpable pressure that settled in the air around him, silencing idle thoughts and commanding an absolute instinctual deference. He did not move, did not need to. His stillness was the center of this world, and everything, including her own frantic heartbeat, seemed to revolve around it. His court was arrayed before him, a silent, watching gallery of equally beautiful and terrifying beings. These were the elven nobles, their faces masks of serene contempt as their gazes fell upon her. Their xenophobia was a tangible force, a wave of cold disdain that washed over her, making her feel like a piece of filth that had been tracked into their pristine sanctuary. She could hear their thoughts in the subtle curl of their lips, in the slight, dismissive narrowing of their eyes. Human, mortal, unclean. Theron seemed oblivious to their judgment, yet she saw the tension in the set of his jaw, the way his long fingers rested on the arm of his throne, not relaxed, but coiled with a tightly controlled strength. He was their king, their sovereign, but he was not beyond their judgment, and she and the boy were the fulcrum upon which their disapproval now rested. In a moment of unguarded stillness, as his eyes swept over the silent court, Ilara saw it. It was a flicker, a brief, almost imperceptible shadow that crossed his features, but it was enough. Beneath the eternal calm, behind the mask of unflappable authority, was a profound and suffocating despair. It was the look of a man watching everything he had ever known or loved slowly turn to dust before his very eyes. The silver withering was not just a political problem or a magical affliction. It was his personal failure, a curse woven into the very fabric of his being and his bloodline. For all his power, for all his centuries of life, he was utterly helpless to stop it. This gilded cage of a kingdom was also his tomb, and his hidden fragility was the bone-deep loneliness of a king fated to preside over the slow, silent death of his entire civilization. The reason for her presence here was not mercy. It was a desperate, final gamble. Ancient prophecies, long dismissed as folklore, spoke of a catalyst, a spark of untamed, chaotic human magic, potent enough to disrupt the curse and reignite the fading heart of Erindor. They had searched for generations, seeking a great mage or a prophesied hero, but the whispers of magic led them instead to the borderlands, to the faint, flickering aura of a terrified, orphaned child. Leo was the key, the spark they so desperately needed, but his power was wild, untethered. It required an anchor, a conduit, and the rituals demanded a sacred bond. She, the boy's fierce protector, was to be that anchor. Her forced marriage to the king was not a union of hearts, but a cold, magical transaction designed to formalize the bond and allow Theron to channel the boy's power into the dying land. She was left in a small, cold antechamber, the heavy marble door closing behind her with a sound of finality. The room was bare, save for a single silver bench, and the silence pressed in on her, amplifying the frantic rhythm of her heart. She was a pawn in a game whose rules she could not comprehend, a tool to be used by a desperate king. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to take Leo and run back to the familiar misery of her old life. But she knew there was no escape. She was a prisoner in this beautiful, dying world. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened again. A guard, his face a mask of impassive stone, stood in the doorway. His eyes not meeting hers, he spoke, his voice as cold and devoid of emotion as the polished walls around them. "The king requires your presence." Now, a chill of pure terror shot through her. She thought not of pacts or prophecies, but of punishment. She had already failed. She was led not to the grand throne room, but to a smaller, more intimate chamber that felt far more intimidating. It was a library of sorts, filled with the scent of ancient parchment, drying herbs, and the faint, almost imperceptible odor of decay that seemed to cling to the very air of this kingdom. Theron stood by a tall, arched window that overlooked a garden where silver-leafed trees stood like elegant skeletons. Their branches tipped with the creeping grey of the withering. He did not turn as she entered, his posture a study in rigid control. The silence in the room was a physical weight, pressing down on her, magnifying the sound of her own ragged breathing. He was a king, a being of immense power, yet in his stillness she sensed the crushing burden of a man watching his world die one leaf at a time. His presence consumed the space, making her feel small, mortal, and utterly out of place. Finally, he turned, his silver eyes sweeping over her, and the gaze was as invasive as a physical touch. There was no pity in his expression, only a cold, methodical assessment, like a craftsman examining a flawed but potentially useful tool. "You fought to keep the boy alive," he stated, his voice a low, resonant murmur that vibrated through the floorboards. "You endured hunger, scorn, and isolation for him. Why?" The question was not born of curiosity, but of a need to understand the mechanics of her devotion. He was gauging the strength of the bond he intended to exploit. Ilara clutched Leo's hand tighter, her knuckles white. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but a spark of defiance flickered within it. "He was alone," she answered, her voice raspy but firm. "No one else would. It is not a thing that requires a grand reason." Her simple human explanation seemed to hang in the air between them, an alien concept in this world of ancient pacts and cold prophecies. A flicker of something, perhaps frustration, or a weariness that ran deeper than bone, crossed his features before being suppressed. "Grand reasons are all I have left," he admitted, turning back to the dying garden. He spoke of the silver withering, not with the detached rhetoric of a king addressing his court, but with the raw, hollowed-out pain of a personal failure. He described the magic of his people fading like a dying ember, the life force of their sacred groves draining into the blighted soil. "This curse is in my blood," he confessed, the words tasting like ash. "For centuries, my line has held it at bay, but the strength of our magic wanes with each generation. I am the last of a long, failing line, and I am presiding over the twilight of my race." It was the first true glimpse behind the mask of eternal authority, a confession of utter helplessness from a being who was supposed to be a god. His gaze then fell upon Leo, and the cold assessment returned, now sharpened with a desperate, terrifying hope. "The old texts spoke of a catalyst," Theron explained, his voice losing its personal inflection and becoming hard once more. "A spark of untamed magic, born of the mortal world's chaos, potent enough to sever the curse and reignite the heart of Erendor. We searched for a great mage, a prophesied warrior, a king among men." He paused, his eyes locking with hers. "Instead, the whispers of fate led us to a starving child in the dust. The power within him is a wildfire, raw and untethered. It is the only hope this world has left." Ilara felt a wave of cold dread wash over her. She pulled Leo behind her, her body forming a fragile shield. He wasn't just a king seeking aid, he was a predator who had found his prey, and she was the only thing standing in his way. "His power requires an anchor," Theron continued, his tone becoming flat and transactional. "The ancient rituals that can channel it demand a sacred, foundational bond, a link between the mortal spark and the royal bloodline of this land." He took a deliberate step towards her, closing the distance until she could feel the chill emanating from his body. His silver eyes held hers, devoid of any warmth or emotion, as he delivered the most insane, world-shattering pronouncement she had ever heard. "You will marry me," he commanded, the words dropping into the silence like stones. "You will become my queen, the human consort to the elven throne. It will be a marriage in name only, a performance for my court and a vessel for the magic, a political necessity." He spoke of their union as one would speak of signing a treaty or sacrificing a pawn in a game of strategy, utterly devoid of any human meaning. He saw the disbelief and horror on her face and pressed his advantage, laying out the terms of her gilded cage with chilling precision. Refuse, and you will be returned to your hovel, to the slow death of starvation and scorn. Accept, and you will have a life you cannot fathom. He painted a picture of her deepest, most impossible desires: endless food, warmth, safety from a world that had only ever shown her cruelty. He promised her silks and jewels, but his true leverage was far more potent. The boy will be protected, he vowed, his voice a silken trap. He will be raised as a royal ward, educated by the finest tutors, wanting for nothing. He will never know hunger or fear again. I am offering you the one thing you have bled for, the one prayer you whisper in the dark, a future for him. It was a masterful, cruel temptation, targeting the very core of her being, the fierce, protective love that was both her greatest strength and her most profound weakness. Ilara's world tilted on its axis. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to spit in the face of this arrogant, manipulative king who saw her and the child she loved as nothing more than instruments for his salvation. To accept was to sell her soul, to chain herself to this cold, dying world and its colder, desperate ruler. But the image he conjured was too powerful to dismiss. She saw Leo's face, his cheeks finally full, his eyes bright with laughter instead of clouded by hunger and fear. She thought of the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs, a constant companion that had dictated every moment of her life. He was offering her an escape, not just from poverty, but from the crushing weight of her own failure. It was a choice between a freedom that meant certain death and a prison that promised life. The silence stretched, thick with the weight of two worlds hanging in the balance. Her voice, when she finally found it, was surprisingly steady, forged in the fires of a life that had tried and failed to break her. She met his gaze, and for the first time, she did not feel like a beggar in the presence of a king. She felt like an equal, a bargainer with a single, priceless asset. "I accept," she said, and a collective, unheard breath seemed to be released in the room. Theron's impassive mask did not change, but she saw a flicker of triumph deep in his eyes. He had won, but she was not finished. "I will be your queen," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I will wear your rings and your titles and play the part you require, but on one condition." She took a small step forward, placing herself between the king and the boy. "Leo will never be your heir. He is not a prince to be used for your succession or your politics. He is my son, and your crown will protect him, but he must also be protected from it. That is my price." A flicker of triumph in his eyes was her only confirmation. The bargain was struck. There was no grand celebration, no period of adjustment. The union was a matter of state and magical urgency, and it was to be sealed immediately. She was led from the library to a different chamber, one that felt older and more sacred, its walls carved not from marble, but from the living, silver-barked wood of the ancient trees themselves. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and old stone, and a single beam of ethereal light pierced the gloom from a high, unseen window, illuminating a circular dais in the center of the room. This was not a hall for a wedding, it was a chamber for a sacrifice, a place where pacts were forged in magic and shadow, and she was the offering laid upon the altar of a dying kingdom. The elven court was already assembled, a silent, statuesque gallery of perfect, disdainful faces. They lined the walls, their silver and midnight blue robes blending with the shadows, their eyes gleaming with a cold, unified contempt. They did not whisper or murmur. Their judgment was a silent, oppressive force that pressed in on Ilara from all sides, seeking to crush her spirit before the ritual even began. She was a blight in their pristine world, a mortal weed in their immaculate, dying garden. Her threadbare, borrowed gown felt like a costume. her calloused hands a mark of shame, her very heartbeat a vulgar, frantic noise in the hallowed silence of their world. She felt their collective will pushing against her, a silent, unified prayer for her to fail, to be consumed, to simply cease to exist and trouble their eternity no longer. Theron stood waiting on the dais, a figure of impossible, remote majesty. He was not dressed as a groom, but as a king performing a solemn duty, his robes the color of a starless night sky, a simple circlet of woven silver his only crown. His face was a mask of perfect, impenetrable composure, but Ilara, now attuned to the subtle currents of his being, could see the microscopic tension in his jaw, the rigid control in his posture. He was not merely a king enforcing his will. He was a desperate man playing his final, most dangerous card, and he was doing it before a court that watched his every move with the predatory patience of vultures. He was as much a prisoner of this ritual as she was, bound by the weight of a crown and the slow, inexorable decay of his entire civilization. An elderly elf, his face a roadmap of ancient sorrows, stepped forward to officiate. He did not speak of love, or companionship, or shared futures. He spoke in the ancient elven tongue, a language that sounded like the rustling of leaves and the cracking of ice, and his words were of binding, of pacts, of the merging of blood and magic for the preservation of the realm. Ilara understood none of it, yet she felt the meaning in the very vibrations of the air. This was a legal and magical contract, a recitation of clauses and consequences. She was binding her life force, her mortal anchor, to his royal bloodline, weaving her fragile, fleeting existence into the fraying tapestry of his eternal one. She stood motionless, Leo's small hand a warm, solid weight in hers, repeating the single word she had been taught. "I bind myself." When the ancient elf's gaze fell upon her, the moment came for the physical sealing of the pact. Theron turned to face her, and the vast chamber seemed to shrink until it contained only the two of them. Trapped together in the single beam of light, he reached for her hand, and the contact was a shock, a jolt of ice and fire. His skin was cool as the marble of his halls, yet where his fingers closed around hers, a strange, unexpected energy sparked. A thrum of immense, contained power that vibrated up her arm. It was not a gentle touch, it was a claiming. His grip was firm, absolute, the hand of a king who was accustomed to taking what he needed. She looked from their joined hands to his face, and his silver eyes were fixed on her with an unnerving intensity, as if he were trying to see past her skin and bone to the very core of her soul, weighing its worth. The officiant presented two simple, unadorned bands of pale silver, which seemed to drink the light from the room. They were not rings of love, but fetters of obligation. Theron took one and, without breaking eye contact, slid it onto her finger. It was cold and impossibly heavy, a physical manifestation of the gilded cage she had just accepted. The weight of it felt absolute, a permanent brand that marked her as his, as belonging to this world. Then, her hand trembling slightly, she took the other band and slid it onto his finger. For a being of such power, his hand felt surprisingly human in that moment. The bones and sinews beneath the cool skin, a reminder that even he, in his own way, was flesh and blood, capable of being broken. The moment the ring settled on his finger, the air in the chamber grew still, the magic of the pact clicking into place with a silent, terrifying finality. "It is done," the officiant declared, his voice echoing in the sudden, profound silence. "By the ancient laws and the fading light, they are one." A collective, almost imperceptible sigh rippled through the court, not of joy or relief, but of grim acceptance. The distasteful act was complete. The human was now their queen. Ilara felt a wave of dizziness. the reality of her situation crashing down on her with the force of a physical blow. She was bound to this cold, powerful being, this desperate king, in a way she could not comprehend. She was the Queen of Erindor, a title as alien and unbelievable as the silver trees and glowing marble. She belonged here now, and she had never felt more alone, more terrified, or more hopelessly out of place in her entire life. The final part of the ritual was public, a performance for the watching eyes of the court. The officiant's voice was low but clear. "Seal the bond." Theron did not hesitate. He stepped closer, his body eclipsing the single beam of light, casting her in his shadow. She could smell the faint, clean scent of winter air and ancient stone that clung to him. He raised a hand, not to her face, but to her arm, his fingers closing around her bicep with that same possessive strength. It was a gesture of control, a reminder of who held the power in this arrangement. His head dipped, and she instinctively closed her eyes, bracing herself for a cold, sterile press of lips, another clause in their contract to be fulfilled and forgotten. It was a duty, a formality, and she expected it to feel as empty as the promises of the gods. The kiss, when it came, was exactly as she'd expected for the first heartbeat. His lips were cool, the touch as impersonal as the silver ring on her finger. It was a king's seal upon a treaty. But then something shifted. A subtle, almost imperceptible change occurred in the space of a stolen breath. The pressure of his lips deepened just slightly, and a flicker of unexpected, startling warmth bloomed between them. His grip on her arm tightened, not with control, but as if he were steadying himself, as if the contact had shaken him as much as it had her. It was a moment of profound and terrifying connection, a brief, unguarded lapse in the performance that betrayed a truth neither of them was prepared for. This was not the sealing of a contract, it was the striking of a match in a room filled with dry tinder. He pulled back, and the space between them crackled with an energy that had not been there before. His mask of composure was back in place, but his silver eyes burned with a new, unreadable light. He looked at her not as a pawn or a tool, but as a woman whose touch had just sent an unforeseen tremor through the foundations of his world. The court saw nothing but a duty fulfilled, a distasteful ritual concluded. They could not see the invisible, shimmering thread that had just been woven between their king and the mortal girl. But Ilara saw it. She felt it. The pact was sealed. The cage was locked, but the door to a far more dangerous prison, one of shared secrets and an impossible, undeniable attraction, had just been thrown wide open. The gilded cage of Erindor had a rhythm, and Ilara found herself slowly, reluctantly learning its steps. Mornings were spent in the vast, silent gardens, where Leo, for the first time in his life, could run without fear. She watched him, chase shimmering, silver-winged insects among the skeletal trees, his laughter a strange, vibrant sound in the hallowed quiet. Theron often observed them from a high balcony, a remote, statuesque figure against the pale sky. She would feel his gaze like a physical touch, a silent weight that was both possessive and strangely protective. In these moments, the gnawing hunger in her belly had been replaced by a different kind of emptiness, a profound and bewildering loneliness in the midst of impossible splendor. She was safe, she was fed, but she was a ghost of a different sort now, haunting halls of marble instead of a hovel of mud. Their evenings frequently found them in the royal library, a cavernous space that smelled of ancient parchment and dust. While Leo slept under the care of a silent attendant, Ilara attempted to decipher the history of her new people. The intricate script a barrier as formidable as the court's disdain. One night, as she struggled with a particularly dense passage on the lineage of kings, his shadow fell over the page. Theron stood beside her, his presence consuming the air. He didn't speak, but simply pointed a long, elegant finger at a complex glyph. "It means burden," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to resonate in her bones. His hand lingered near hers, not touching, but close enough for her to feel the cool aura of his power, a silent, charged current that made her breath catch in her throat. The fragile peace of these quiet moments was inevitably shattered by the court. At a formal banquet, seated beside Theron on a raised dais, Ilara felt 100 pairs of cold, ancient eyes upon her. Lord Valerius, a noble with a cruel slash of a mouth and eyes like chips of ice, raised his goblet. "A toast," he announced, his voice carrying through the silent hall, "to the king's novel approach to our salvation. May the fertile soil of the mortal realm prove as fruitful as we all hope." The insult was veiled, a slick, poisoned dart aimed at her humanity, her commonness, her perceived sole purpose as a vessel. A ripple of cruel, knowing smiles spread through the assembled nobles. Humiliation, hot and sharp, washed over her, and she felt as small and as dirty as she had in the borderlands. Begging for scraps, Theron did not move, save for a slight, deliberate turn of his head. His gaze fell upon Valerius, and the temperature in the hall seemed to drop by several degrees. The king's voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a shard of glass. "Lord Valerius," he said, his tone dangerously soft, "I was unaware you had become an expert in the study of mortal realms. Perhaps you would prefer to continue your research there." Permanently? The threat was unspoken but absolute. Valerius's face went pale, the smirk dissolving into a mask of fear. He bowed his head, murmuring an apology. The silence that followed was absolute, a testament to the king's power. Theron had not defended her honor, he had asserted his authority, and she was, for better or worse, an extension of it. Later that night, she stood on a balcony overlooking the dying gardens, the chill of the air a welcome shock to her still-burning cheeks. She heard his silent approach behind her. "Valerius fears change," Theron stated, standing beside her, his gaze fixed on the blighted trees. "He leads a faction that believes our salvation lies in purity and isolation, not in alliances." He was treating her not as a wounded creature to be soothed, but as a strategic partner, explaining the political landscape of their shared prison. "They do not see a queen," he continued, his voice laced with a weariness that seemed centuries deep. "They see a symptom of my desperation, a contamination. Their scorn for you is merely a reflection of their judgment of me." In that moment, the chasm between them felt a little smaller, bridged by a shared enemy. A few nights later, a cry from Leo's chambers jolted her from a restless sleep. She found him thrashing in his bed, caught in the grips of a nightmare. She gathered him into her arms, murmuring the same soothing words she had used in their hovel, her presence a familiar anchor in the terrifying newness of his world. When she looked up, Theron was standing in the doorway, a silent shadow. He watched them, and for a fleeting instant his regal mask slipped, revealing a profound, ancient loneliness in his silver eyes. He stepped forward and held out his hand. Lying on his palm was a small, exquisitely carved bird made of silver wood, its details perfect. He offered it to Leo, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "The spirits of the forest will guard your dreams now," he said. The gesture was so unexpected, so tender, it felt like a physical blow. Ilara found herself watching him more and more, searching for these cracks in his icy facade. She saw the way his jaw tightened when the council spoke of the withering, the subtle grief in his eyes when he looked at the dying trees, and the guarded softness that appeared only when he looked at Leo. She would twist the heavy silver ring on her finger, the cold metal a constant reminder of their pact, of the lie they were living. But was it still a lie? When he looked at her across a crowded hall, his gaze was not that of a king surveying a political asset. It was something more, something deeper and far more dangerous. The thought took root in her mind, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Are we really just pretending? The carefully constructed walls of their arrangement were beginning to crumble, and she didn't know if she wanted to rebuild them. The pressure from the court was relentless. During a formal council meeting, with Elara seated on a smaller throne beside his, Lord Valerius once again took the floor. Your Majesty, the withering continues its advance. The marriage has stabilized the decline, but it has not reversed it. The prophecy speaks of a ritual, a channeling of the catalyst's power. The court grows restless. They question the efficacy of this mortal bond. His words were aimed at Theron, but his dismissive gaze was fixed on her. He was painting her as a failure, a faulty component in the great machine of their salvation. The weight of their expectation was a physical force pressing down on her, reminding her that her life and Leo's depended on a magic she could not comprehend and a role she felt wholly inadequate to play. The attacks grew more personal, shifting from political maneuvering to petty, public cruelties designed to remind her of her place. While walking a path lined with weeping silver willows, a high-born elven lady named Lyra, a known ally of Valerius, moved past her. With a flick of her wrist, Lyra stumbled, spilling the contents of her dark berry wine directly onto the front of Elara's simple, human-spun dress. "Oh, my deepest apologies," Lyra cooed, her eyes glittering with malice. "Such a rustic fabric. It soaks up stains terribly, doesn't it?" Several other nobles who had been watching laughed softly, their amusement a chorus of condescension. It was a child's prank, but it was also a declaration of war, a clear message that she would never be one of them, no matter what title she held. Before Elara could even react, Theron was there. He had been walking a few paces behind, and he moved with a swift, silent grace that was utterly arresting. He ignored Lyra completely, his very presence dismissing her as insignificant. He walked directly to Elara's side, and without a word, he unfastened the magnificent silver-embroidered cloak from his own shoulders. He draped it around her, the heavy, cool fabric enveloping her, covering the dark stain and cocooning her in his scent of winter and stone. He then turned his head just enough to fix Lyra with a look of pure ice. "The Queen of Erendor wears what pleases her," he stated, his voice calm but lethal. "And her pleasure is the law of this land. Remember that." It was not just a defense, it was a coronation, a public and undeniable declaration of her worth in his eyes. The court was left stunned and silent in their wake as he led her away, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. Back in the safety of their private chambers, the air between them was thick with unspoken emotions. The grand gesture had shattered the last vestiges of their cold, contractual arrangement. She turned to thank him, to say something, but the words caught in her throat. He was looking at her, wrapped in his royal cloak, and his silver eyes were burning with an intensity that had nothing to do with politics or prophecies. It was raw, unguarded, and deeply personal. He raised a hand, his fingers hesitating for a moment before gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. The fleeting touch was like lightning, a silent confession that this pretense had become a truth too powerful for either of them to deny. Their charged silence was broken by the urgent entry of a royal herald, his face pale with importance. He bowed low, avoiding their eyes. "Your Majesties," he stammered, "a summons from the High Seer, the celestial convergence. It has accelerated. The alignment will be perfect in 3 days' time." A chill that had nothing to do with the evening air settled over the room. The grand ritual, the desperate, final gambit to channel Leo's power through their bond and heal the land, could no longer wait. The theoretical performance of their marriage was over. The real, terrifying test was upon them. As the weight of his kingdom crashed back down upon Theron's shoulders, Elara knew that their enemies now had a deadline, and the fragile, burgeoning connection between them was about to be thrown into the heart of the fire. The news of the accelerated timeline fell like an executioner's axe, severing the fragile, shimmering thread that had just been woven between them. The warmth of Theron's protective gesture vanished, replaced by an arctic chill that seemed to emanate from the king himself. He immediately withdrew, the vulnerable man who had draped his cloak around her receding behind the impenetrable mask of the sovereign. For the next 2 days, he became a ghost in his own palace, poring over ancient texts and celestial charts in the library, his focus absolute, his silence a crushing weight. He did not speak to her, did not look at her, did not acknowledge her presence beyond the barest of formalities. To Elara, this cold distance was a cruelty far sharper than any noble's insult. It was a negation of everything that had begun to grow between them, a stark reminder that she was, and had always been, nothing more than a functional component in his desperate plan. Finally, unable to bear the suffocating silence any longer, she cornered him in the library late one night. The vast chamber was lit by a single sphere of captured moonlight, casting long, skeletal shadows from the towering shelves. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice a low, trembling whisper that was nonetheless a challenge. "Why do you shut me out now, when we are closer than ever to the precipice?" Theron did not look up from the star chart he was studying. "Sentiment is a luxury we cannot afford," he stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "The ritual will require absolute focus. It will draw upon a power that could shatter mountains. It is volatile. My distance is not a punishment, Elara. It is a shield, for you and for the boy." But his justification felt hollow, an excuse crafted to keep his own heart locked away. "You are not shielding me," she shot back, her voice gaining strength. "You are hiding." Her accusation struck a nerve. He finally looked up, and the raw torment in his silver eyes stole her breath. For a moment, he seemed on the verge of collapsing, the centuries of his burden pressing down on him. "You think I do not know what I am asking of you?" "Of him," he rasped, sweeping a hand across a pile of brittle scrolls. "You believe this is a simple matter of a magical bargain?" He stalked to a locked case, retrieving a single, dark red cylinder of bound parchment. He unrolled it on the table between them. The script was ancient, jagged, and seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. "The prophecies the Council clings to are incomplete," he confessed, his voice dropping to a near-inaudible whisper. "They speak of a catalyst and an anchor. They omit the final line, the line that speaks of the price, the one that says, the spark, once given, may be extinguished forever." The meaning of his words settled upon her slowly, then, all at once, a wave of icy horror that threatened to drown her. This wasn't just a risk, it was a potential sacrifice. The ritual might not just channel Leo's power, it could consume it entirely, leaving him a mindless, empty shell, or simply gone. Every act of kindness from Theron, every protective gesture, was instantly and irrevocably tainted. He had not just brought them here for salvation, he had brought them here to place Leo upon a sacrificial altar. "You knew," she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips, her body shaking with a grief and fury so profound it left no room for tears. "You knew this was a possibility from the very beginning." The trust she had so tentatively placed in him, the fragile hope she had allowed to bloom in her heart, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He was not a savior, he was a monster wearing a king's face. Seeing the absolute ruin in her eyes, the king's composure finally, completely broke. The mask of eternal authority disintegrated, revealing the tormented, desperate man beneath. He took a hesitant step toward her, his hands outstretched as if to ward off a blow, or perhaps to plead. "When I sought the catalyst, I was seeking an abstraction, a magical force, a thing to save my people," he confessed, his voice cracking with a pain that mirrored her own. "I did not know it would have a name. I did not know it would be a boy who dreams of wooden birds. I did not know his protector would have eyes that hold the strength of a dying star. He was no longer speaking as a king to his consort, but as a man confessing his soul's deepest conflict. To lose this kingdom is a fate I have long prepared for, he whispered, his gaze burning into hers. But to lose you, that is an ending I cannot bear to face. Before the raw, agonizing weight of his confession could settle, before she could even begin to process a world where this monster might also love her, the grand library doors swung open with a resounding boom. A royal herald stood silhouetted against the light of the corridor, his face grim and pale. He bowed low, his voice echoing in the charged silence that had fallen between them. "Your Majesty," the herald announced, his tone laced with an urgency that spoke of crisis. "The full council has been convened in the Grand Hall. Lord Valerius has invoked the ancient right of public petition and demanded an immediate address regarding the final ritual." The herald raised his eyes, his gaze shifting to Elara, who stood frozen in her grief. "They await their king," he declared, his voice ringing with finality, "and they await their queen." They walked into the Grand Hall not as king and consort, but as two souls condemned to the same fate, bound by a terrible, shared secret. The air was thick with a predatory silence, the assembled nobles a gallery of beautiful, cold-faced executioners. Lord Valerius stood before the twin thrones, his posture one of righteous indignation, his voice ringing with false piety as he laid out his accusations. He spoke of blasphemy, of a king so desperate he would taint the sacred royal bloodline with a mortal commoner. He painted Elara as a human parasite and Leo as an unwitting sacrifice upon the altar of Theron's failed reign. Elara stood beside the throne, feeling the crushing weight of 100 pairs of ancient, hateful eyes. Her grief was a cold stone in her gut, but beneath it, a new and unfamiliar fire was being stoked, a defiant rage against these beings who would speak of sacrifice while having never known true loss. Theron listened to the litany of accusations, his face an unreadable mask of stone. When Valerius finished, a suffocating silence descended, awaiting the king's judgment or defense. Theron rose slowly, his movements deliberate, his presence commanding the absolute attention of the hall. He did not look at Valerius, but let his gaze sweep over the faces of his court, holding each of them accountable. "You speak of tradition," he began, his voice a low, resonant thunder that vibrated through the marble floor. "You cling to the purity of a past that has led us to this slow, suffocating decay. For centuries, we have looked inward, admiring our own fading light while the world outside us burned with a life we deemed beneath us. Our pride has become our tomb." He paused, his silver eyes finally finding Elara's across the dais. "This alliance is not a blasphemy," he declared, his voice softening with an emotion that stunned the court into silence. "It is our only penance." Valerius, sensing the shift in the court's mood, turned his venom directly upon Elara. "Penance?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You would have us believe this mortal is our salvation. Look at her. She is born of dust and desperation. She is a vessel of misfortune, a creature of fleeting passions and inevitable decay. She is nothing." The word hung in the air, a final, brutal blow designed to shatter her completely. But it did not. In that moment of ultimate humiliation, something within Elara broke free. She took a step forward, away from the shadow of the throne, and the fire in her soul erupted. "You are right," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing with a power no one in that hall had ever heard from her. "I am mortal. I have known hunger and grief and loss you cannot even comprehend, and I would endure it all again, 1,000 times over, to protect my son. You speak of power, but you know nothing of strength." Her defiance was a spark in the tinderbox of the hall. She turned her gaze from Valerius to Theron, her eyes blazing with the pain of his betrayal and the impossible truth of his confession. "And you," she said, her voice breaking with raw emotion, "you would sacrifice an innocent child to save these stones and shadows. Is your crown worth more than his soul?" Her question was not a political challenge, but a deeply personal plea, an ultimatum that demanded he choose. Seeing her, so fierce and so broken, standing alone against his entire world for the sake of a child, Theron's final defenses crumbled into dust. He descended the steps of the dais in 2 long strides, ignoring the gasps of the court, and went to her. He took her calloused hand in his, raising it not to his lips, but to his heart, pressing it against his chest in a gesture of absolute surrender. "No," he said, his voice for her alone, yet it carried to every corner of the silent hall. "It is worth nothing." He then turned to face his stunned court, his hand holding hers as if it were the only anchor in the universe. "You wished for a final prophecy to be revealed," he announced, his voice ringing with an authority that was no longer just a king's, but a man's. "Then hear it now. This kingdom can turn to silver dust and be scattered by the wind. I will not sacrifice this child, and I will not lose this woman. She is not my consort. She is not a vessel. She is the heart of this land, and she is the heart of me. She is my queen." He leaned in and kissed her, a deep, soul-shattering kiss in front of all his people, a public declaration that sealed not a pact, but a promise. As their lips met, a single, withered silver leaf on a branch visible through the high arches of the hall shimmered and slowly, impossibly, began to turn a vibrant, living green. In the seasons that followed, the green spread from that single leaf, a slow, miraculous wave of life that pushed back the silver, withering one branch, one grove, one forest at a time. The magic of Erendor had not required a sacrifice of power, but a sacrifice of pride. It had needed not a magical catalyst, but an emotional one. Elara and Theron ruled not from separate thrones, but side by side, their love the foundation of a new, stronger kingdom built on the union of 2 worlds. She taught his people the meaning of resilience, and he taught her the peace of finally being home. One afternoon, watching Leo chase butterflies in the now thriving royal gardens, Theron came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting a hand gently on her stomach, where a new life, a new hope had just begun to stir. Their journey from dust to divinity was complete, a testament to a love that had defied death itself. If their story has moved you, please show your support by liking this video, commenting on your favorite moment, and subscribing for more tales of love against all odds.